Hello, my name is Jørgen Sejersted, and I'm a professor of literature at the University of Bergen, Norway. And I'm also the chair of the Holberg Prize board. Now, the Holberg Prize was established in 2003 when the Norwegian government decided to set up two major prizes in research areas that are not covered by the Nobel Foundation. The Holberg Prize is administered by the University of Bergen, and it is awarded to outstanding scholars within the fields of humanities, social sciences, law, or theology. So the prize is awarded by the board on the recommendation of an international committee of scholars working from nominations from academics from all over the world. We also have a prize for young scholars. We have an extensive school program for pupils in Norway in the upper secondary school. And we also organize a Holberg debate on pressing issues of our time. So please visit our website for further information. And if you hold a position at an academic institution, please consider submitting a nomination for an award winner. Now, the Holberg Prize, in cooperation with earlier laureates, we try to raise the global awareness of the prize and, of course, to promote outstanding scholarly work internationally. So this year we are visiting India, and it's very nice to be here. And we have been in Jaipur at the Jaipur Literary Festival, and now we are here in Delhi cooperating with the Shiv Nadar University. And we are very honored to be joined by Professor Stephen Greenblatt. He was a Holberg Prize Laureate in 2016. Now, Stephen Greenblatt, he is the John Cogan Professor of Harvard University. He is a Renaissance scholar. He was the leading figure in the New Historicism, and he has written best-selling books like Will in This World, How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare from 2004, and the Pulitzer Prize winning The Swerve, How the World Became Modern from 2011. And his latest book is called The Second Chance, and is about Shakespeare and Freud. So, as I said, we are very happy to be presenting Professor Greenblatt, and he will engage in conversation with Professor Sambudha Sen of the Shiv Nadar University. Professor Sen is a specialist in 19th century literature, and he has specialized in the authorship of Charles Dickens. And I will mention his book, Charles Dickens' Novels in the Age of Improvement. Professor Sen also has extensive knowledge of Greenblatt's oeuvre, and personally, I'm looking very much forward to this conversation with Professor Sen and Professor Greenblatt. Thank you for your attention.
I'm absolutely delighted for this opportunity to be talking to Professor Greenblatt, who's here in India under the auspices of the Holberg Prize Committee. Professor Greenblatt is, what can I say, one of the greatest scholars of English literature of our times. He's won not just the Holberg Prize, but also the James Lowell Prize and the Pulitzer Prize. He's a professor at Harvard. He's written some of the most important books on the early modern period. Thank you, Stephen, for being here. And I'm Sambudha Sen, and I teach in Shiv Nadar University. Stephen, if you might start off, the Holberg Prize itself, it does feel, doesn't it, like the Fields Medal in mathematics or even the Nobel Prize? Because, I had a look at the winners, and they are, if you look at it from the field of literary criticism, among the best people you can think of. There's Frederick Jameson and Julia Kristeva. What does it feel like to be Holberg Prize winner?
Of course, it's a huge honor, and I was very, very grateful for it, Sambudha. It means a lot to me personally, but I think the thing to emphasize, or at least for me, the thing to emphasize, is the fact that the Norwegian government, which funds the Holberg Prize, had a visionary idea, which was to create a major prize in those fields that are not recognized by the Nobel Prize. There's probably a certain amount of Norwegian, Swedish competition. And the reason that it's visionary is precisely that the idea that a prize for theology, law, social science, and the humanities deserves the kind of attention that the Norwegian government, through the Holberg Prize, wished to give it, seems to me, particularly now, at this moment in our culture, seems to me a crucial gesture, and more than a gesture. So, of course, I feel it personally. I'm grateful for it, enormously grateful and humbled by it. But it's really the larger picture that I think is worth reflecting on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, the Holberg Prize needs to be known all over the world, just as the Nobel Prize is.
They're trying. One of the reason that I'm here in India is that they've made the wise decision. They realize that the Holberg Prize has largely gone to European and North American scholars, and they realize there's a gigantic, vibrant, intellectually exciting culture in India that they want to reach in the way of getting nominations. So for anyone who happens to hear this conversation that we're having, you should know that you can nominate people for the Holberg Prize, and they will enter the pool that the Holberg Commission is looking for.
That's fantastic. But Stephen, if I might go back to where it all started, to your Berkeley days, and to that, what can I call it? An astonishing conjunction of minds, out of which representations, new historicism emerged. What is it that sparked it all off? I know the excitement that many of you, with excitement that accompanied Foucault's visit to Berkeley. Were there other people who influenced your thinking? What were those early meetings like of the representations group?
The first thing to say, Sambudha, is that it was great to be young. It's always great to be young. And I came to Berkeley at the age of 25, my first job, straight out of graduate school, having a newly minted PhD. And Berkeley was a wonderful and very wild place. There was the smell of tear gas in the air mixed with the smell of eucalyptus leaves. There was an air of craziness about it all. It was sometimes quite tiresome, but it was also remarkably liberating and energizing. And there was at that moment, the University of California was expansive and expanding, and that included the humanities. So I had a huge cohort of young colleagues. We were we were a generation that was, we say, feeling our oats, as I say, feeling very energetic and independent. So that I remember someone saying that to me before I was going to Berkeley, "My God, you're going to Berkeley," because the year before all hell had broken loose in Berkeley, and there were enormous numbers of arrests and helicopters flying over the campus, and still in 1969 when I arrived, it was totally crazy and wild. But it was, I would say, a crucial part of the zeitgeist of Berkeley that helped to generate, not only my intellectual career, but that of so many of my friends and colleagues. It was a spectacular moment of intellectual and generational independence.
Wow. If I could stay with new historicism for a bit, I'd really like you to tell us a little bit about, two tensions that I sort of see in your work. One which I think you share with other new historicists, or I should actually say the first generation of new historicists, and the second which is particular to your work. And the tensions are these. The first is, you work with seemingly marginal material, material that no historian would actually touch. And yet you use this material to get at the really big things, the absolutely central works of English literature, Shakespeare, Dickens, George Eliot, stuff like that. On the other hand, absolutely central ideological formations, political, economy, religion. So that's the first tension between the marginal and the absolutely central. And the other, which I think is particular to you, is, I'd imagine materialism is a credo. I mean, the swerve, could be called an ode to materialism, as far as I can see. So it's a real credo. But you're equally interested in Hamlet in Purgatory, in hallucinations, dreams, and above all, ghosts. Would you say a little bit about those two tensions?
Yes, they're two important but quite different things, so maybe they're related, Sambudha. I mean, first thing to say, let me take a step back to New Historicism. Everything in anyone's trajectory depends on where you come from, who your teachers were, what you learned, and what you were absorbing and what you were rebelling against. So I had a wonderful education at Yale University in the early 1960s, at the moment of the absolute triumph of new criticism. And my professors included people like Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren. These were the giants of American new criticism. And what new criticism, of course, meant was a deep dive into the formal elements of the work of art. A sort of passionate attention to those elements without any attention, any interest, in fact, a kind of aversion to anything in the surround. Work of art,
as you put it.
Yeah, so my people like William Wimsatt, also at Yale when I was there, as a kind of major, extraordinary figure, said, look, a work of art is like a machine or a pudding, as you put it. You are not interested in the life of the cook who cooked the pudding. You're not interested in the mechanic who made the machine. So according to Wimsatt, you're interested in whether the machine works and what the pudding tastes like. And so any concern for anything outside the work of art is irrelevant. It's a fallacy, as he put it. So that's the education that I had. And how shall I say? I bit the hand that fed me.
Well done.
I'm extremely grateful to that education, and I'll come back to that. It's actually quite important for me personally. But after leaving Yale, I went to Cambridge University on a grant for a couple of years to do another BA, to do the Tri-Plus exam. And there, partly it was that generational moment that I've already talked about that led to the craziness of Berkeley, but was already swirling around in the mid-1960s. But I also studied with Raymond Williams, particularly, and I'd never encountered anyone before Williams who actually had a Marxist, was absolutely off the table at Yale, a Marxist approach to literature, but not so much the Marxist theory, qua theory. It was the interest in a whole set of forces that were never part of the discourse of the new criticism. So that was a startling awakening for me. And then when I went back to Yale for graduate school, I decided that I wanted to pick up something that I had encountered in Cambridge when I was studying for the tripos. Maybe this is too personal, Sambudha, so maybe it wouldn't be entirely relevant to the larger intellectual trajectory.
Everything's relevant.
But one of the papers, as they call them, that for the exam papers for which one studied at Cambridge, was called 1579 to 1603. It's a relatively short period of time. I actually didn't know at the time why they chose 1579 rather than, let's say, 1559 when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne. 1579 was a somewhat mysterious year, but I subsequently learned why. I could come back to. 1603 was the year that Queen Elizabeth died, so it's late Elizabethan literature. And that was a sufficiently short period of time so that you read a ton of things not simply Shakespeare and Marlowe and Spencer and Sidney, but you also read a lot of minor figures. That was the first time also that I had read, to go back to your question, I had read figures who weren't in the immediate circle of the canon. And one of the figures that I read was Sir Walter Raleigh. I read Raleigh's poetry, and I was fascinated by the poetry because it didn't fit any model that I could understand from what I had already read. It seemed odd and eccentric, and it actually, to me, sounded like T.S. Eliot. It's fragmentary, broken poetry. It didn't fit into the culture of the period. So when I went back to Yale, and I knew about Raleigh, I knew that Raleigh had a crazy, colorful life. I said, when it was time to do, I went through very, very quickly. I didn't want to spend a lot of time. I did my PhD very quickly in 3 years when I went back to Yale. And I said, when I was choosing my dissertation topic, I wanted to write about why someone like Raleigh, or specifically Raleigh, who was a pirate, a monopolist, a soldier, a courtier, a killer, why did he write exquisite poetry that sounded like T.S. Eliot? It didn't make any sense to me. And I was told that was precisely, I actually went to someone who subsequently became my friend, Jeffrey Hartman, enormously distinguished critic, but I knew nothing about what Hartman was actually himself interested in. And I told Hartman my idea, and Hartman looked like I had gone crazy. And said, if you want to do that kind of dissertation, he said, you just find a work of Raleigh's that hasn't been edited and edit that. And though I actually think that would have been a good project, I was smart enough to know at the time that I was being sent to the hydroelectric plant in Ulaanbaatar. I wasn't being encouraged. So I just found somebody else to direct the dissertation, a marvelous person, Alvin Kernan, who also was my friend and mentor. And he said, yes, go ahead and do it. And the point was, I didn't want simply to stay inside Raleigh's poetry.
Absolutely.
I wanted to figure out what the hell was going on. Why did this happen at all? And in the course of doing so, I plunged into a whole set of materials. For example, colonialism in Ireland, the attempt to colonize also the territories in the Americas, to start colonies there, also monopoly trading. He trying to get control of huge sums of money, which he did. And finally, treason, betrayal, execution, and so forth and so on. A whole world that was way beyond the boundaries of the poetry in which I was at the time, and I remained very interested, but it was an opening up of a bigger world. And I didn't do it because I was a Marxist thinking of doing it. that although I did think of myself at the time as a Marxist, but I wasn't doing it as a Marxist thesis. I was doing it as an attempt to find out what was going on. Why was this happening at all? And and the other side of new historicism, and that's the crucial thing in Sambudha that I should say, what was going on at the time in the 1580s, the 1590s, and so forth. But why was it reaching me in this strange way? Why was it echoing what I took at the time to be contemporary poetry? That is to say, T.S. Eliot, who was alive then. Why did it sound like modernist poetry to me? And so it was the two wires touching of the 16th century, and then at that point, the late 20th century. That was the spark, as it were, for that work, but also in some sense for the new historicism.
Fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. Wow.
Now, you asked me another question.
I asked the tension between, your absolute embeddedness in materialism and your interest in growth.
Yeah. That leads us in a maybe slightly different direction, and I'm happy to go there. Maybe the simplest thing to say, Sambudha, is that it's not my tension alone. It's a cultural tension of a fairly deep kind, and I am, of course, in a profoundly, I'm visiting a profoundly religious country, a country imbued with religions, multiple kinds, but passionately held. And I come from a country, maybe more surprisingly, the United States, which is also a deeply religious country with large numbers of people are believers. Now, I grew up in a religious household. I have no problem at all with that. I don't feel like I want to have a fight with it. But I think it's a fascinating phenomenon because almost all of the grounding principles that lie behind theological beliefs have been exploded by the science of from the 19th century on, really. So the question is, why didn't religion simply shrivel up and disappear? On the contrary, it's alive and well. And that is a tremendously interesting question, and a question that has a very strong bearing on literature.
Absolutely.
Because literature is in some ways in touch with the ghost in the machine. And if we want to understand the way in which our culture, Indian culture, or the United States, the culture of the United States, remains in touch with religious belief, even though people are going to get MRIs and all kinds of things that are based on principles that are quite antithetical to the foundational beliefs of religion. People don't have trouble with it. And so that's fascinating.
Sure.
Why does someone who believes, as many people do in my country, that the world was created in 6 days by a divine power, how do they reconcile that with the nuclear medicine that they welcome? Well, it's a very interesting question.
Sure.
They don't reconcile it. They have both together.
That's the
in their lives. And so if you ask me why I have both materialism as an intense interest in my work, and I'm fascinated by religion, I would say I just reflect the culture that we both live in.
Sure. I'm going to ask you just one other question on new historicism.
Sure.
Then I want to
ask away.
So the history that you did, you read the first generation, because I don't think the second generation of new historicism was that good, but that's not important. The history that you did was certainly not a history of events. It was not even a history of thought. I've thought about it, and I'd call it a history of mental habits, maybe. That transition in Catherine Gallagher's work from faith, to speculation, and in your work to the cultural imagination of the purgatory. So in a way, you're getting at something that's, as you're just so beautifully putting it, all pervasive, but never touched on. And the result of, what else can I call it except discoveries, result of these discoveries actually turn out to be profoundly generative in your reading of some of, in your engagement with some profoundly literary problems, like the rise of the novel, or what's really happening in Hamlet. So how did you get to this, pervasive yet unseen thing, purgatory, speculation, and then suddenly realize that's the key to unlocking so much that's also relevant to us as scholars of literature?
Well, you've already mentioned in terms of the root,
Yeah.
intellectual root there, you've already mentioned one figure earlier when you talked about, we were talking about Berkeley. This isn't the whole answer, and I'll come back to the larger answer maybe, but um, sometime in the 1970s, I can't remember exactly when, I used to, hard to believe really in a way now because I don't have as much time in my life, but I should have had less time then because I was having children and trying to get, writing my books and so forth. But I used to audit people's classes. I have a kind of crazy, obsessive, random curiosity. So I used to just sit in on people's classes for fun, as if I was still a student, though I was a professor already at Berkeley, but I would ask them if I could do it. I remember going to a class on medieval monasticism. I just randomly would go to classes. And I remember I also would like to try to keep my French language up. So I would sometimes go to classes that were taught in French. And I remember a colleague of mine, Howard Block, who eventually was a part of Representations and remained a good friend. I remember Howard Block said, there's a interesting, slightly strange guy coming for a visiting semester at Berkeley, and he's going to teach a class in French. You might want to go here. And I said, what's the class on? And he said, Emile Zola was the novelist. I said, I'm not interested in Emile Zola. He said, go anyway. You'll enjoy it. So I went to the class, a very small seminar, half a dozen people. I introduced myself to this rather peculiar bald fellow, and he said, yes, I could audit the class. And the class began. He spoke for 2 solid hours without a break, no questions, nothing. That was with the French idea of a séminaire, which is just that the professor talks for 2 hours. And he never mentioned Emile Zola, in fact, not then and not in the whole semester. But it was Michel Foucault, whom I got to know quite well. And he was completely fascinating, talking about actually the medieval confessional, the Catholic practice of the confession, and what cultural importance that had in forming the consciousness of the West and so forth. It was, I thought, thrilling. The next year, almost overnight, it was like one of those crazy stories where there had been a translation of Discipline and Punish, one of Foucault's books, and he became quite famous. So the next year, there were thousands of people trying to get into the class, but at the time, it was just the few of us, and as I say, I got to know him pretty well. And then there were a set of other people. For some reason, lots of people from that French world were interested in coming to Berkeley or to the San Francisco Bay Area. So there was also Michel de Certeau. These are people maybe less famous, but with whom I became very, very good friends. Oh, very, very well. And Tsvetan Todorov. There were a succession of Louis Marin, a succession of wonderful people with whom I became very friendly, and many of whom had the kind of ethnographic, anthropological, and also philosophical interests that led to what you are describing. That is to say, not rounding up the usual suspects, as we say. If for the Marxist criticism that I said I began being interested in, what's the class structure here? Who was taking the bourgeois position, and so on and so on. The kind of position that I had learned from Marxist criticism, but a much more, what I thought, a much more culturally subtle way of understanding what the social forces were that were producing mental formations. So there was that group of people who were quite important to me. And then there were a wonderful group of colleagues, young colleagues. We already mentioned Catherine Gallagher, Michael Rogan, Svetlana Alpers, Leo Bressani, the astonishing British philosopher Bernard Williams, all of whom were in this mix in Berkeley, and I began to show again in a slightly exuberant way, to ask these friends to read my work. And then I would read their work, and we'd exchange criticisms. Often we'd be quite harsh on each other, but it was all low cost, as it were. We weren't trying to win something from each other. We were just trying to help each other or criticize each other. So we had a little group that we put together. And at first we called it the Friends of Stephen Greenblatt. That's what
it was called.
That was initially this little group. And then we thought that was absurd. And we met. We didn't have another name for it, but we met for dinner and argument. It was very, how should we say, it was rather like India, as I imagine it. We argued and argued and argued ferociously into the night. And eventually we said, look, what's going to happen here? We are loving this. We're really learning from each other, but it's going to harden and disappear in the way that things do. It's just going to, we can't keep it up forever. So we have to have something to keep us going that is independent of our dinners. And I think it was at that time my colleague Svetlana Albers, who thought, well, maybe we should have a journal. I then had, at that moment, an offer of a professorship somewhere else. And the University of California, generously to try to keep me, said, what would you need if you wanted to stay at Berkeley? And I said, well, how about money for a journal? And
wow.
they said, okay, yeah. So that's where the money came from. And we were off and running. And that kept us going, because then we were still occasionally met to argue, but what we would do is we would meet together and we would argue about some paper that someone sent us, you or someone else sent us, and we would argue, do we like this? Do we not like this? Should we publish it? And so forth. And it kept us alive intellectually.
Absolutely. For me, the proudest, absolutely the pinnacle of my academic career was publishing an article in Representations, and I'm just so privileged to hear that.
They didn't accept many of my papers, so even though I was right at the center of it, they were a ferocious group. And Walter Ben Michaels and Steve Knapp and all of these people, it was our pleasure and our pain to argue endlessly about these things. I want to mention one other figure, not as part of this world, but who was quite important in helping to answer the question that you asked before, and that was Clifford Geertz. And that came about because I had an invitation out of the blue to go to a conference in what to me was an obscure place in Texas, Georgetown, Texas, it was called, at a university there. And I always loved to travel places, and even though I had never heard of Georgetown, Texas, I thought, what the hell? And I went for this long weekend, and lo and behold, one of the other people at the conference was a very small conference, was Clifford Geertz, and I began to read his work.
Wow.
And we became friends again, and that was a huge influence upon me.
Absolutely. There's so much that I want to ask you. I'm just going to mention something very quickly. I hadn't prepared it, but listening to you, talking about Foucault, the book that I still think is one of your best. Renaissance Self-Fashioning. There's so much Foucault in there. The juxtaposition of the picture and Thomas More's, and then Confession. That's so central in that. Well, I wanted to move to writing. And as I said to you, so your writing is really special. I just mean this very sincerely, because it has that same propulsive energy and that scintillating quality that Clifford Geertz has, or E.P. Thompson. So writing must have been a preoccupation right through. And, your the swerve is at least partly about writing. I mean, one of the great themes of that
Yes.
book is writing. And you look at writing in its materiality. I mean, you look at its means of inscription, but also its erasability. You look at its power to convince, sometimes change the world. That's what you're claiming. Sometimes change the world. And, so writing is absolutely central. I mean, it's a vague question that I'm asking, but I can't help asking this. In the age of artificial intelligence, when so much can be reproduced, where knowledge, is more or less accessible, do you think a signature, I mean, a kind of the ability to stamp a voice is what the humanities can give to the 21st century and beyond? I mean, how important is writing in the humanities?
I mean, it's a wonderful question. I early on, I had grave reservations about the way in which, in literary studies particularly, there was an increasingly hermetic impulse in writing, a way of writing that only a tiny number of people in the innermost circle could possibly understand. And it became a kind of mania in the all through, I think, the 1980s and 90s. You had to try to sound as obscure as possible to be respected. And I occasionally did my best at trying to sound obscure and very, very complicated. But I always had suspicions about that. Taking a step back, I remember writing the first sentence of my doctoral dissertation. So we're talking about 1968, probably. And I remember coming out of my room and saying to a friend that lived across the hall, "I've written the first sentence of my dissertation." And he looked at me skeptically, as he should have. And I said, "Let me read it to you." And so I did. And it was Sir Henry Yelverton, the King's Attorney General, was no friend to Sir Walter Raleigh. So he said, "Yeah." So I said, "Don't you see what's great about this?" He said, "No." He said, I said, "What's great about this is you don't know whether you're reading a novel, a screenplay, a dissertation. You don't know where you are in the discourse. It's not," and that, I don't think I used the word discourse at the time. You don't mean that, but my impulse was to try to write something that would have a kind of, forget, it's not particularly exquisite. There's nothing fancy about the sentence, but just some energy.
Yeah.
And I think we've been, we in the humanities have lost a great deal by trying to impress
Each other.
with our obscure intelligence. I won't name names, but there are people who are basically incomprehensible, but who've made reputations on being incomprehensible. And I think this is an exceedingly harmful phase in our collective lives, because it made us like the obscure scholars in Alexandria in antiquity. And I always felt that it should be possible, if we actually are saying anything interesting, it should be possible to break out of the circle of people who are the experts in our field. And I always longed to do that. It took me many years to figure out how to do that, but it always seemed to me that it should be possible.
Yeah. So the transition must be, from Hamlet in Purgatory to Will of the World. I mean, is that when you?
Yeah, and that is an interesting transition. I loved writing Hamlet in Purgatory. I thought, that is to say, yeah, I had a lot of myself in it. I loved the writing of the book. I loved the subject of the book. But I know the book, I knew at the end, or I knew subsequent to the end, that the book, though I think it is actually to put it fatuously, one of my best books. I thought it was a very good book. It reached a very small number of people. It closed itself off, even though the subject, how do you deal with the dead? What do you do with your beloved dead? How do you relate to them? That is a subject that should reach a large number of people. We all have, alas, losses in our lives. And I was almost there, I felt. I almost had a sense of how to convey to readers, yes, 1,000 readers, even 10,000 readers, but how do you reach 100,000 readers? And with something that you feel is important, that you feel matters, and everyone should care about. And I hadn't yet conceived of how to do that, but I did. I mean, and exactly Will in the World was the moment at which I finally thought, with a lot of work and some help, I finally thought, I think I can do it. I think I can do it.
I just want to ask one. I just have two questions for you, and one that occurred to me right now, which I can't help asking, and it's related to writing. Reading both Hamlet in Purgatory and The Swerve, the figure that came over and over again in my mind, was someone you only mentioned marginally, Christopher Marlowe. I mean, Dr. Faustus. And so the question that I have, and that is directly related to writing, is your discussion on the invocation of Helen in Hamlet in Purgatory.
Yes.
And you see it as a succubus, as you call it. I mean,
yes.
And you sort of track it in a mental habit, the imagined belief of a kind of demon who's both fascinating and dangerous. I was thinking, I mean, the thing is, the stagecraft couldn't have been developed enough for them to actually produce, somebody who has that quality, that combination of fascination and dangerousness. Don't you think it was words? I mean, more than an actual ghostly figure, isn't it a replication? Do you think it's a replication of the Renaissance itself, the capacity that words have to revive the dead? Because it's all working in words. I mean, I don't see Helen as a substantial figure, but I see she has the beauty of 1,000 stars. I mean, it's working.
I'm delighted that you asked me this question, Sambudha. And it's as if you're channeling some secret knowledge which you don't have, which is that I've just completed a book about Christopher Marlowe, which I've been working on for the last 4 or 5 years. It's about to appear in September. It's called Dark Renaissance, the fatal genius of Christopher Marlowe. And it's about how Marlowe, in effect, through his words, through language, did exactly what you're describing and more. And I said at the very beginning of this conversation that I didn't know why 1579 was the year that they chose in Cambridge to begin that paper. It happens they chose it because that's the year of the publication of Spencer Shepard's calendar. But actually, the significant point is that if you came to England ever as a visitor from New Delhi or anywhere else in the 1550s, 60s, 70s, and said, "Who are the great writers?" they would look at you like you're a little crazy, or maybe they would say William Warne or Nicholas Gouge, people that you won't have heard of, because there weren't any great writers. Because virtually nothing was happening. And the reason nothing was happening is they chopped off too many heads in the 16th century. They had one swing back and forth in too many swings of religious faith, and always accompanied by punishments and tortures. And Marlowe, crazy, wild, genius Marlowe, who was murdered at 29, who paid the price, he broke that container, that was holding everyone in. And Dr. Faustus is a perfect example. Dr. Faustus, we have very little evidence of how people responded to the plays in the 16th century, but it happens we have two pieces of evidence about Dr. Faustus, which is very rare. One is that there was a performance of Dr. Faustus in which, in the middle of the performance, the actors became panicked because they thought there was an extra devil on the stage. So they thought that they had conjured up a devil, and they ran off the stage. They just got too frightened themselves. So something about the language and performance of the play scared them. And the second piece of evidence that we have is there was a performance in the theater in which there was a noise, a cracking of the wood that the theaters were made of, probably just settlement. I mean, and the audience panicked in the middle of a performance of Dr. Faustus. So something about the play reached some place of terror, of danger, as you put it, in them, and that had, as well as the magnificence of the play.
Wow. And Dr. Faust, the other thing, we don't have to go into this because I'm going to ask you the last question, but it's got that drag of it's a dirty drag of God. I mean, but he actually invokes that atomistic thing in the last, what he described in the Swerve. She says,
a million water drops.
Yeah, and he's saying that, why don't I become water drops? And he's, but I can't. I mean, but that's a whole different,
whole other subject.
Whole other subject. The last thing I wanted to ask you, Stephen, is this. You, E.P. Tom, I mean, Michel Foucault, I mean, Clifford Geertz, I mean, one sentence and a particular kind of intelligence, is already evident. And it's an intelligence that we can only associate with the humanities, I mean, how do you think of it? Because, I'm asking this question, keeping in mind the mental habit of so many young people in India, I'm sure across the world, that the humanities don't really require an intelligence, I mean, it's more like, if you can't do science, you may as well do humanities, What do you think constitutes intelligence that is specific to the humanities? I mean, what kind of, what would you be able to put some words to it? I mean, what is it that constitutes as intelligence in humanities? Because I can't think of your writing or E.P. Thompson's writing as anything but intelligence.
I want to say, I'm sorry, I want to say that, as you've already alluded to, the Swerve is a profoundly important book to me because it is built around a poem that was also a great contribution to science. Lucretius's De Rerum Natura is a poem, and it also is the core of the theory of atoms that has had such a profound influence upon our world. So the idea of a radical split between the form of intelligence that goes into STEM and the form of intelligence that goes into the humanities seems to me a mistake. Of course, these are different paths to take, and profoundly different now, particularly because of the training you need to receive, first and foremost, actually in mathematics, if you want to go into any serious STEM subject. And I have nothing but the hugest admiration for this, so I don't feel competitive or anxious. I mean, we can put aside the AI question for a moment. One of my wonderful friends in your country, in India, is a scientist named Raghavendra Gadekar, a marvelous scientist who's also a wonderful writer, but he works on wasps, on social wasps, those creatures that sting you but also build these beautiful little paper houses for themselves. And he, among the many subjects he works on, is questions of succession. How do they know who succeeds if the queen of a wasp colony dies. And he's done incredibly brilliant work on questions of succession. But my point is that that is a profoundly literary question. It's a question that is also addressed by King Lear and by other of the greatest works that we have. And Raghavendra and I have spoken together about this. There's no abyss across which we speak. We speak sharing our profoundest interests. So for me, that's quite crucial. Of course, I couldn't do with wasp colonies what he does, and he couldn't do with King Lear, I don't think, what I do. And that is to say, these are different paths that we take using different parts of our brain and our soul. But the idea that there's a huge abyss that separates them seems to me false.
Thank you, Stephen, very much. It was a real pleasure. I mean, I've waited for this day, and it sort of descended on me completely, what can I say, unawares. And it's a real pleasure. What I'm going to do after we are through is I'm going to get you to ask you to sign 2 books.
Oh, with pleasure. Delighted to do so. And I want to thank you, Sambudha, for this conversation.